This is a law school case brief. Well, hey there, and welcome back to my channel, where we analyze landmark legal cases so you don't have to. Today, we're diving into a case that's a sequel of sorts to a previous case we've covered. Yes, today we're going to talk about the second Wagon Mound case, namely Wagon Mound No. 2. So grab your tricorn hats and prepare to set sail because we're going to look at this case together. All right. So in 1961, the Wagon Mound suffered an oil spill in Sydney Harbor. We talked about that in another video. And after that oil spill, there was a fire caused by sparks from nearby welding work. Now, unlike in the first Wagon Mound case where the issue was whether damage from fire was foreseeable at all, in the second case, which came up just 5 years later, the issue was more nuanced. The question was whether damage from fire was foreseeable even though it was unlikely. You might think this is a bit of a strange scenario to consider, but stay with me here. It will make sense in the end. So stick around. So let's start with the facts. After the original oil spill in the first Wagon Mound case, obviously, the ship owners wanted to get compensated for the damages they suffered. However, their claims were rejected because the damage was too remote. In other words, the damage was not foreseeable. However, this sequel involves different plaintiffs. These plaintiffs were the owners of the ships that were destroyed in the fire. Because this case involved different parties than the first case, we have to remember that the issue of foreseeability needs to be considered anew for these new parties. So although the damage was deemed not foreseeable in the first case, that does not bind the court in this second case. However, this time the facts were slightly different. Remember in the first case, the issue was whether the risk of fire was foreseeable at all. Here in the second case, the issue is whether the risk of fire was foreseeable even though it was unlikely. Okay, now what happened in the second case? Well, the oil from the Wagon Mound seeped into the seabed and spread across the surface of the water. Now molten metal, again from nearby welding work, fell into the oil and ignited, causing a fire that burned away several ships that were moored nearby. Those ships were destroyed. Now this time the plaintiffs were the owners of those ships, and they sued the defendants who were the owners of the Wagon Mound. The plaintiffs argued that even if the risk of fire was small, it was foreseeable, and that the risk of fire could have been eliminated with a little effort. Basically, they said that the risk of fire was foreseeable and that the cost of preventing the damage was minimal. Therefore, they should be compensated for the damage they suffered. Okay, so what was the decision? Well, let's see. When making their decision, the Privy Council had to consider the rule of law, namely, the rules on negligence. Now, as you may recall from our previous videos, the basic rule in negligence is that the harm must be reasonably foreseeable. Now, reasonably foreseeable can mean two things. First, it can refer to the type of harm, but more specifically in this case, it refers to the scope of the duty of care. In other words, to whom does the defendant owe a duty of care? Now, generally, in negligence, a defendant is not liable for damage that is too remote. In other words, if the harm is foreseeable but unlikely, the defendant will usually not be liable for that harm. However, as the court pointed out, there was an important caveat to this rule. This was established in the first Wagon Mound case. If the risk is foreseeable, even if it's unlikely and the burden of avoiding that risk is minimal, then the defendant can be liable for failing to act. So in essence, this case was about balancing the risk of fire against the burden of taking preventative measures. Now, let's apply this to our facts. Was the risk of fire from the oil foreseeable? Even though it was unlikely, the engineers who gave evidence agreed that fire from spilled oil was possible. So the court found that the risk of fire was not far-fetched. However, the court also noted that the burden of preventing the fire was minimal. For instance, the welding work that caused the fire could have been stopped until the oil was cleaned up, or the oil could have been cleaned up before the welding commenced. Instead, however, the defendants chose to ignore the risk entirely. Now the court found that a reasonable person would not have ignored a real risk, however small, when the burden of eliminating that risk was negligible. Therefore, The court ruled that the defendants were liable for the damage caused by the fire. Okay, so why does this case matter? This case matters because it established the principle of risk balancing. Now, this is often referred to as the second Wagon Mound test. Before this case, the courts had to consider the likelihood of harm and the seriousness of that harm in determining whether a duty of care was breached. However, after this case, courts were required to weigh the risk of the harm occurring against the burden of taking preventative measures. Well, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I hope you learned something. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Until next time, I'm the host. Keep thinking. It's a superpower.